Hey guys, it's Maria, and today I'm going to be going over a passage from the SAT Writing and Language Test, also known as the grammar section on the SAT. So I'll be breaking down this particular passage about the consolations of philosophy, and I'll be going over all the questions and just giving you an in-depth analysis of my thought process of how I would answer these questions. Before I get started, I just wanted to mention, like in my previous writing and language test general overview video, that I am a native speaker, so I apologize, an English native speaker, so I apologize in advance if my advice isn't particularly helpful to non-native speakers. I'm just trying to go with what I know, based on my knowledge in answering these questions. So yeah, apologies in advance if my advice is like kind of vague or unhelpful at times. Okay, so going back to what I mentioned with the SAT Writing and Language Test General Overview video, if you watched it, my main takeaways are pretty much that efficiency and conciseness are key here in this section. So really focus on trying to pick the answers that generally have the least number of words, avoid wordiness, convoluted ideas, things like that, and try to keep that in mind as we go over these questions here. Okay, so I'll start by reading the passage, and then we can go over the questions. The consolations of philosophy. Long viewed by many as the stereotypical useless major, philosophy is now being seen by many students and prospective employers as in fact a very useful and practical major, offering students a host of transferable skills with relevance to the modern workplace. In broad terms, philosophy is the study of meaning and the values underlying thought and behavior. Okay, so we have question 34, and as you can see, it's basically asking you to pick the transitional phrase that makes the most sense in terms of meaning in the sentence. So if we ignore the underlined terms first, the sentence is basically just talking about what the standard dictionary definition of philosophy is, right? So the opening of the passage has a very clear, some have previously thought that, philosophy is not very helpful, but recently in actualization, the author is making an argument that, opinions have changed. And so we can see how the author describing what philosophy is in broad terms, as the passage says, is, a continuation of that argument, the flow, build up, everything like that. So with the first option in 34, which is what's already in the passage in broad terms, philosophy is the study of meaning and the values underlying thought and behavior, that, at least to me on first glance, makes sense because, again, the sentence is just talking about the definition of philosophy, so by explaining it in broad terms, it is in broad terms the definition, so that makes sense to me, but we can also go over the other answers just to eliminate our other options here. So then B, for example, so this doesn't really work in this situation because, like I mentioned earlier, this is literally just a definition of what philosophy is in the sentence, and you're not giving an example of anything, especially philosophy, so it wouldn't really make sense. So I'm going to eliminate B just because, again, the sentence doesn't have any examples or anything like that. Alright, and then C in contrast. So, kind of like with the example question, kind of like with option B, for example, there isn't really any contrast displayed here, like I mentioned previously, just the sentence is just focusing on a definition, so, there's not any real contrast that I sense here. In addition, if you think about the passage in terms of, a more abstract, argumentative, English major type way, it wouldn't really make sense to place contrast so quickly into the beginning of the passage too. This is the second sentence. If the author is basically putting his thesis as the first sentence of actually philosophy is more useful than we previously thought, then stating contrast immediately after that would not strengthen your argument and in general would probably undermine it. So also eliminating option C because we don't see any contrast here, and in terms of a strong argument, that also wouldn't make sense. And then finally D, nevertheless. So kind of similar to C, when you use nevertheless, it implies that you state something controversial in the previous sentence, and with this sentence you're now contradicting that to some extent, kind of going against what you've previously said and going basically in a different direction. And so again, we don't really see that with this sentence because the author's stating the definition of philosophy is building upon their argument, to strengthen their point that philosophy is useful, and we're not seeing any contrast, any contradictions, things like that. So with all that in mind, I'm going to eliminate option D as well, and it looks like the option is A. So if you watch my SAT reading passage video, then you'll notice that it's like a little easier to cross off options here in the grammar section. In the reading passage, when it talks about, like argumentative stuff, it can be kind of difficult to like eliminate answers, but in terms of the writing and language section, it's generally pretty straightforward when things are wrong, as long as, like pay attention to all the options, make sure you've gone over everything, and then, narrow down the correct choice. Okay, moving on to question 35. But more pragmatically, the discipline encourages students to analyze complex material, question conventional beliefs, and express thoughts in a concise manner. Okay, so this question, in terms of like question type of what it's asking, is slightly different. You can see that all the answers have pragmatic or pragmatically in some form or some way or shape. And so the question here is really about wordiness and conciseness, and making sure that you choose the answer that is the, least wordy and makes the sentence flow the least with the least amount of words. Sorry, that sentence was wordy. But yeah, just trying to choose the simplest response here. So if we look at option A, which is already in the passage, but more pragmatically, the discipline encourages students to analyze complex material, question conventional beliefs, and express thoughts in a concise manner. So just based on that, at least visually, we can see that option A is 2 words, while the other options are at least 4 or 5. So just from a visual, general standpoint, we can see that option A is less wordy and shorter, and, basically gets the point across that this point that the author is making is pragmatic. So I'm leaning towards option A at the moment, just again because of the sheer number of words and how few there are in this first option, but we can also go over the other ones just in case. So then B, speaking in a more pragmatic way. So like all the other options here in 35, they all pretty much say the same thing, but with option B, it basically just takes more words to say the same thing. And so there's nothing wrong with it in terms of like meaning or message, but if you put in the sentence, but speaking in a more pragmatic way, the discipline encourages students to analyze complex material, question conventional beliefs, and express thoughts in a concise manner. It's just a lot of words to put in a sentence, so because of wordiness, I'm going to eliminate the option. Okay, and then option C, speaking in a way more pragmatically. So this is kind of similar to option B in that it is, again, more wordy than the first option, but C is also slightly, if anything, a little grammatically incorrect if you put in the sentence, but speaking in a way more pragmatically, the discipline encourages students to analyze complex material. It's wordy, it also is a little confusing too, so I'm also going to eliminate this choice because of wordiness and because it's not as direct as it could be in its language. Then finally D, in a more pragmatic speaking way. But in a more pragmatic speaking way, the discipline encourages students to analyze complex material. Yeah, so this is kind of like, D is like a combination of B and C, and that's wordy and like convoluted and grammatically incorrect, but like all of those elements amplified. So, it's wordy. It's wordy, grammatically incorrect, like all the elements that we don't want in our writing, and makes it just harder to get our ideas across cleanly. So with all that in mind, we can pick A as well for our answer. Okay, moving on to question 36. Because philosophy teaching students not what to think but how to think, the age-old discipline offers consistently useful tools for academic and professional achievement. So we can see that 36 is a question about like verb tenses. So similar to 35, all of these words pretty much are like the same, but just making sure that we choose the right tense here. So with A first, just off the bat, because philosophy teaching students doesn't really make sense just grammatically as you say it out loud in the sentence. So I'm going to eliminate that. And then moving on to option B, because philosophy teaches students not what to think but how to think. So that makes more sense already grammatically, and is also slightly shorter too, if that helps. So, and also it matches the other verbs in the sentence too. If we look at, to think but how to think, teaches goes along with that, like same active tense, active verb, everything like that. So we're going with B so far, but we can also eliminate our other options. C, because philosophy to teach students not what to think but how to think. Yeah, so, just by reading it in your head or out loud, it sounds grammatically incorrect, so you have to eliminate that as well. And then D, and teaching, because philosophy and teaching students not what to think but how to think. Again, similar to the other incorrect options, it just sounds grammatically incorrect. Going back to my warning at the beginning of the video, sorry if this just sounds kind of vague. I'm not really an expert at explaining grammar, but just for like other native speakers like myself, you can just kind of tell when like words and phrases sound kind of funny. Okay, so with all that in mind, we're gonna go with B, because philosophy teaches students not what to think but how to think. The age-old discipline offers consistently useful tools for academic and professional achievement. Okay, question 37. A 1994 survey concluded that only 18% of American colleges required at least one philosophy course. Okay, so this question is asking which choice most effectively sets up the information that follows. So it's basically a context question asking you which sentence would make the most sense directly tied to the next sentence. And with questions like this, we want to make sure that we really focus on, directness. If you watch my SAT reading section video, then you'll know that I really focus on making sure that your ideas are directly connected to each other. And just because you may be able to approximate ideas closely to each other doesn't mean that it's necessarily correct. We really have to focus on detail, attention, and directness here. Okay, so the first option we have is A. Consequently, philosophy students have been receiving an increasing number of job offers. A 1994 survey concluded that only 18% of American colleges required at least one philosophy course. So, just based on what each sentence is talking about here, so with A, we have a sentence which is talking about philosophy students receiving an increase in job offers after graduating, and then the following sentence has, explicit quantitative data of how most colleges don't even have a requirement for a single philosophy course. So, talking about philosophy courses versus jobs, showing a decreased number of courses at some schools versus an increased number of jobs, that doesn't really match up with each other, much less what the author is trying to argue about how philosophy is important. I'm just going to redo that. Okay. So with all that in mind, I'm going to eliminate that answer. Okay, option B. Therefore, because of the evidence, colleges increased their offerings in philosophy. So, similar to option A, option B talks about increasing course offerings in philosophy, but then the following sentence after 37 talks about how most colleges don't have a philosophy requirement. So, because it doesn't line up when talking about requirements and courses, it doesn't really make sense, and also B talks about increasing the number of courses, while the later sentence talks about, if anything, a decrease because of the lack of requirements. So with all that in mind, we can also eliminate that because those two sentences contradict each other and don't add to the argument really at all because of all that contradiction. And then C, notwithstanding the attractiveness of this course of study, students have resisted majoring in philosophy. Okay, so with this one, the first part of the sentence here in C, notwithstanding the attractiveness of this course of study, sounds like a little irrelevant here. Although the author here is trying to argue that, philosophy is a useful major, or is a useful pursuit in jobs and everything like that. The author is trying to make it, a very, at least so far, seemingly data-driven argument. and not really something like, oh, because students just like philosophy. So that already sounds like not super direct in terms of argument. And then the second half of the sentence, students have resisted majoring in philosophy. And then again, the sentence after 37 talks about how most colleges don't have philosophy requirements. And so that difference between talking about requirements versus requirements versus majors, everything like that, just not aligning subject-wise. Although they both talk about philosophy, it's not the same sort of philosophical discussion in terms of like college requirements and classes and everything like that. I'm gonna eliminate the option. Okay, then finally D. However, despite its many utilitarian benefits, colleges have not always supported the study of philosophy. So, because we've also eliminated the other options, we can see that this is the correct answer because it aligns with, the decrease that the author talks about with philosophy requirements and courses. So by talking about how colleges have not always supported philosophy, we can then see a direct support for this argument, as in the following sentence, it talks about how most colleges don't have requirements that their students take philosophy courses. So the claim and the evidence match up. So with all that, we can say that this is the correct answer. Okay, and then question 38. Therefore, between 1992 and 1996, more than 400 independent philosophy departments were eliminated from institutions. Okay, so this is another transition question asking about like the meaning of different transitional phrases and making sure that you choose a transition because it aligns with the meaning of the point you're trying to get across, and not just because it like sounds like or approximates the meaning you're trying to get at. So option A, we have our first choice. Therefore, between 1992 and 1996. Okay, so with therefore really demands like a lot of directness in that the previous sentence really needs to, like support what you're trying to therefore conclude. And so this question is tricky because therefore, thus, moreover, however, like honestly, they all like kind of sound the same, at least initially, right? But there is narrow, like really small differences between them. And therefore implies that the previous sentence is, directly supporting the claim that you make in the next one. But if we see in 37, it talks about how like a small minority of American colleges don't have philosophy requirements, right? And then in 38, they talk about how because of this, a lot of philosophy departments were eliminated from the institutions. But and even though that's, like kind of relevant, it doesn't exactly align because you don't have philosophy requirements doesn't mean that you may have to eliminate a department because there could still be philosophy majors, stuff like that. And so there isn't a directness an argument that we want here. If the 1994 survey in question 37 talked about how the philosophy departments are struggling financially or in terms of students or something like that, that would make sense if philosophy departments were then cut from those institutions. But because it just talks about a graduation requirement or something from these colleges, it doesn't really align. So therefore, although it may seem correct, is not the most correct answer, if that makes sense. So so I'm gonna eliminate A for now. So if you also watch my general overview video, then you'll know that I really emphasize, paying attention in detail in this section because, with previous questions, 36, for example, it is generally pretty simple to solve just by, reading it and picking the verb that sounds most correct. But with questions like 38, it can be really tricky to sit down and really analyze what each of these phrases means. Okay, so option B. Thus, between 1992 and 1996, more than 400 independent philosophy departments were eliminated from institutions. Okay, so thus is kind of similar to therefore, and that demands a lot of directness of if this, then that, then, consequently, therefore this. So thus pretty much falls on the same line of reasoning as therefore, of because those two statements are not directly linked to each other, it's hard to put therefore and thus because those phrases demand that you have really clear, like, direct claims to each sentence in your paragraph, and if you don't, it can look weak to try to jump between arguments and different points along the argument, if that makes sense. So because of that, I'm also going to eliminate thus for the same reasoning as therefore. Let me just move this down so it's a little clearer to see. Okay. And then C, moreover. So if you can see already, this transitional phrase is slightly different from therefore and thus in that it doesn't demand a direct conclusion to be drawn from the previous sentence, but like a slight variation of adding to that similar subject, but not demanding, it to be on like the same vein or anything. So moreover already makes a lot more sense because both of these sentences talk about, similar subjects. They're both talking about philosophy. But while one is talking about how few colleges support like philosophy requirements for graduation, and the other sentence talks about how philosophy departments are being eliminated from institutions, those are two similar problems, but they're not exactly the same that you would, need for to use therefore or thus. So moreover already makes a lot more sense in comparing like really similar subjects. So I'm going to lean towards that as the correct answer, but we can also eliminate D just to make sure. And then D, however. So however is different because it is like, again, a contrast. So if you can look between these two sentences, there isn't really any contrast, right? They talk about philosophy in terms of college and how both like graduation requirement wise and also department wise they're both kind of lacking, but they're not, I wouldn't say like direct contradictions to each other. It wouldn't be strange to put these two sentences next to each other without a however. So because of that, I'm going to eliminate that option because these sentences are similar enough that it wouldn't really make sense to make a contrast between them if they don't need a contrast. Okay, so with all that, the correct answer is C. Okay, moving on to the next page. More recently, colleges have recognized the practicality and increasing popularity of studying philosophy and have markedly increased the number of philosophy programs offered. By 2008, there were 817 programs, up from 765 a decade before. In addition, the number of four-year graduates in philosophy has grown 46% in a decade. Also, studies have found that those students who major in philosophy often do better than students from other majors in both verbal reasoning and analytical writing. These results can be measured by standardized test scores. Okay, so question 39. Which choice most effectively combines those sentences as their underlying portion? So, similar to question 35, this question talks about wordiness and conciseness, and all the options pretty much cover the same meaning in relatively generally the same words, but we're trying to just cut down on the number of words we use and to convey the same idea. Okay, so option A is writing as. So if we reread the sentence, those students who major in philosophy often do better than students from other majors in both verbal reasoning and analytical writing, as measured by standardized test scores. So similar to question 35, we can already see that the options here, if you just look at them from a visual perspective, option A is shorter than the other ones and, pretty much gets this point across of just connecting these two sentences together in, as simple as two words, while we can see that the other options, cover like 4 or 5 words. So with all that, I'm leaning towards option A at the moment, just, because it gets the job done in 2 words, while we can see that the other options are a lot more lengthy. But again, we can eliminate the other options. So option B. Students who major in philosophy often do better than students from other majors in both verbal reasoning and analytical writing, and these results can be measured by standardized test scores. So I'm going to eliminate option B because, like I mentioned when I was talking about option A, it, pretty much gets the same meaning across, but that's not what we're really testing for in this question. We're really looking at wordiness and trying to make sure that our phrases aren't too convoluted, because although it may be all right in like one portion of a sentence, when you then add up the whole sentence, all those like lengthy phrases over time can get really convoluted and just basically make the message or the meaning you're trying to get across in the sentence like disappear. So we're going to eliminate B for convolutedness in wording, although the meaning basically carries the same idea. And then C, writing, which can also be. So those who major in philosophy often do better than students from other majors in both verbal reasoning and analytical writing, which can also be measured by standardized test scores. So similar to B in that although it does have fewer words than B, it is still also convoluted and wordy, so I also have to eliminate that, especially because compared to A, we can see, how many more words, how much more time, even like fractionally, it takes to say than what A is, which is just writing as. So then that is also eliminated as an option. And then finally D, those students who major in philosophy often do better than students from other majors in both verbal reasoning and analytical writing when the results are measured by standardized test scores. So unlike options B and C, D doesn't even have a comma after writing, which makes the whole sentence when you insert it in just sound like a really, really long like run-on sentence. So I'm also going to eliminate that because of wordiness and also just because of lack of punctuation, which makes this long sentence feel longer than it already is. So with all that in mind, we're going to go with option A. Okay. And then question 40. I'm just going to read the context sentence before. On the graduate record examination, for example, students intending to study philosophy in graduate school has scored higher than students in all but 4 other majors. Okay, so this is another one of those verb tense questions where we can see that's all the same word but just different verb tenses, and we just have to choose the correct one. So just based on reading that, those students intending to study philosophy in graduate school has scored higher, that already is grammatically correct because students are plural, it uses has instead of have. So I'm going to eliminate that option for grammatical incorrectness. And then B, students intending to study philosophy in graduate school have scored higher than students in all but 4 other majors. So yeah, reading that sounds grammatically correct. I'm leaning towards that answer at the moment. But again, just eliminating your other options just to be sure. But, uses the correct verb tense of have, given a plural subject. And then C scores. So students intending to study philosophy in graduate school scores higher than students in all but 4 other majors. Again, similar to A, it just sounds grammatically incorrect. And yeah, just is like an incomplete transition of the phrase, if that makes sense. And then finally D, scoring. Students intending to study philosophy in graduate school scoring higher than students in all but 4 other majors. So similar to C, when you are missing the have verb, it just sounds kind of funny and doesn't really complete the thought. So also eliminating D because of grammatical incorrectness. So with all that, we have B as the correct answer. Okay, and then 41. These days, many students majoring in philosophy have no intention of becoming philosophers. Instead, they plan to apply those skills to other disciplines. Okay, so another one of those slightly tricky verb tense questions. So what we currently have is using the wrong apostrophe right off the bat. It's using a possessive, singular student apostrophe instead of putting it behind the S here. Oops, sorry, that was bad. Moving the S to about there. Okay, so I'm gonna eliminate option A because I can just tell right off the bat that they're using a singular possessive apostrophe instead of a plural one. And then B, students majoring in philosophy. Oh, no, sorry. There is no possessive, my bad. I just got confused. Okay, I think what I meant to say was if it was a possessive when they were talking about students, it would be behind the S, but in this case, there is no possessive needed. So option A is still incorrect. Okay, and then option B, these days many students majoring in philosophy have no intention of becoming philosophers. So this looks like the most correct option so far. My bad earlier with the apostrophe, because there is no like possessive action necessary here. It's really just like straightforward talking about the students and what they're majoring in. So this looks like the most correct answer so far, but we can also eliminate other options. So then C, students major. These days, many students major in philosophy have no intention of becoming philosophers. So I have to eliminate C because of the tense. It should be majoring instead of major. Just when you read it, it sounds kind of off. And then finally, D, students majors. These days, many students majors in philosophy have no intention in becoming philosophers. So similar to D, C uses the wrong tense and then also adds the incorrect possessive in terms of like a singular student, and also using the wrong verb tense in majors. So with all that in mind, also gonna eliminate D, which gives us B. Okay, and then question 42. So, law and business specifically benefit from the complicated theoretical issues raised in the study of philosophy, but philosophy can be just as useful in engineering or any field requiring complex analytical skills. That these skills are transferable across professions, which makes them especially beneficial to 21st century students. Okay, so those two sentences cover questions 42 and 43. So let's first go over 42. At this point, the writer is considering adding the following sentence. The ancient Greek philosopher Plato, for example, wrote many of his works in the form of dialogues. Should the writer make this addition here? Okay, so we're really talking about argument and kind of like flow of like passage and argument here of, do you really need this additional context? So if we look at what we have here, so this sentence would be before that these skills are transferable across professions, which make them especially beneficial to 21st century students. And before this intended addition, we have law and business specifically benefit from the complicated theoretical issues raised in the study of philosophy, but philosophy can be as useful as in engineering or any field requiring complex analytical skills. So what here we're really talking about is the skills that philosophy can provide. So the author is really talking about the skills that you can have in like the workplace, like particularly like critical thinking skills and everything like that with a philosophy degree. And basically nowhere in this does he really mention the origin of philosophy. So he briefly does so like in the introduction a little bit of the passage when he talks about the definition of philosophy, but in everything that the author talks about from then on, it's really relevant to, like modern philosophy in schools, in colleges, and how it's applicable to the workplace. So an additional sentence talking about how Plato like first discovered the origin of philosophy and things like that wouldn't really make sense like time period wise here, and also you don't really need that to understand how philosophy is useful in a modern workplace. So just right off the bat, it seems kind of unnecessary, but we can go over the options. So A, yes, because it reinforces the passage's main point about the employability of philosophy majors. So I'm gonna eliminate option A because by inserting the little sentence, like context about Plato and how back in ancient Greece he was able to like write many of his works in the form of dialogue, that doesn't tell us anything about the employability of philosophy majors today. It, like time period wise, it's like pretty off. And then also in terms of like employability, the only context about philosophy here is that Plato just so happened to be a philosopher who wrote dialogues, while, the author here is talking about grad school, employability, studying philosophy in terms of critical thinking. Like, all of this doesn't really make sense in like a modern context. So eliminating A. And then B, yes, because it acknowledges a common counter-argument to the passage's central claim. I'm gonna also X that one off because I don't think that the additional sentence about Plato really provides a counter-argument for anything. It's like really just a pure factual statement, and the author is just claiming that philosophy can be also useful today. And by Plato just so happening to be a philosopher who wrote dialogues like thousands of years ago doesn't really add or even remove from any of that, so I'm also going to eliminate that option. Okay, and then C, no, because it blurs the paragraph's focus by introducing a new idea that goes unexplained. So this seems like the correct answer to me, because it basically goes over everything that I mentioned earlier, and that this sentence doesn't really add anything. If anything, it might take away from the focus, which is precisely what I was talking about earlier. So I'm leaning towards this option, but we can also eliminate the last one just in case. So finally, D, no, because it undermines the passage's claim about the employability of philosophy majors. So this sentence doesn't really undermine anything, nor does it really add anything. It, again, like I mentioned, is just a purely factual statement about like Plato and his philosophical works. So this obviously has nothing really to do with how employable philosophy majors are. So with all that in mind, I'm going to eliminate D, and the correct answer is C. Okay, last two questions. So we can see that 43 is like a transitional phrase question, making sure, again, to try to avoid like wordiness and making sure that our claims and ideas are clear. So that these skills are transferable across professions, which makes them especially beneficial to 21st century students. So what we have initially with option A sounds a little unnecessary, that these skills are transferable across professions, which makes them I don't think you really need the which there. I think it would also make sense if you just talked about that these skills are transferable across professions, makes them especially beneficial to 21st century students. So the which isn't really like detracting anything too much as, just a singular word in there, but it also really isn't adding anything to the sentence. It doesn't need to be there based on grammatical correctness. And so it's just kind of like an additional word in the bump that you don't really need in terms of just getting the point across about what the sentence is really saying. So I'm leaning towards not keeping that which, although going over the other options, we may be able to find a different word choice alternative. But for now, I'm going to eliminate A, just because when you read the sentence over, it, is grammatically correct when you include the which, but I could also see it without the sentence, so it doesn't feel all that necessary. Okay, and then B, that these skills are transferable across professions, that makes them especially beneficial to 21st century students. So that sounds a little more off grammatically than which. Again, it isn't super obvious between that and which and everything. You still get the point of the sentence, but it's just a little bit off enough, and really in writing you're trying to make sure that every word you include is there for either the sake of grammatical correctness or also trying to push your point forward. And so if a word is just kind of there, any of these words like that, which all these filler words that aren't necessary, you can take them out to really make the sentence more direct and smooth. And so with that, I'm also going to eliminate that for similar reasons, and that it could be added. It wouldn't be anything too detrimental, but it wouldn't also add a lot. Okay, and then C, and so that these skills are transferable across professions and makes them especially beneficial to 21st century students. So we can see that with adding these different types of words, the meaning of the sentence changes a little. So which is makes the sentence more of like connects the two parts of the sentence together, talking about the transferable skills and then how they're beneficial, and versus that kind of uses these two parts of the sentences to talk about these transferable skills which are also happen to be beneficial, and then and also combines these two ideas, but again is an unnecessary word, I think, in this sentence of you don't really need this like bumper transitional word in there, and then also changes the meaning of the sentence to kind of like almost separate the ideas of transferable skills and then how they benefit students. So because of like slight wordiness, I'm going to eliminate that as well, which leaves us with our option D, that these skills are transferable across professions makes them especially beneficial to 21st century students. So like I mentioned earlier, making sure that you maintain attention and detail to this section of the test, because even though it's only one word, unlike the other questions we had, like, you know, like 40, 41, questions 35, there's not that much like obvious wordiness here, but you know, like even one word can add up and make a sentence feel like slightly heavier than it needs to be. So with all that in mind, option D. Okay, and then our last sentence. Because today's students can expect to hold multiple jobs, some of which may not even exist yet during their lifetime, studying philosophy allows them to be flexible and adaptable. High demand, advanced exam scores, and very professional skills all argue for maintaining and enhancing philosophy courses and majors within academic institutions. Okay, so this is just a simple, like, grammatical correctness question. So with what we currently have, some of which may not even exist yet during our lifetime. Okay, so that's the initial one, and that's the initial option with option A. And in terms of keeping like subjects in this passage, so far it's been very like third person, right? In terms of just talking about students and how they have how they've like pursued like majors, careers in philosophy, everything like that. And so using R randomly in the end of the passage sounds a little strange. So I'm gonna eliminate option A for now, because if you see in the beginning of the sentence, it talks about because today's students. So when you mention students, you would expect that the author then subsequently refers to them as them or they, and because the author then switches to R, like this like weird collective we, even though they've been talking about like a professional they for the entire passage, it just sounds kind of weird. And it breaks up that continuity. Okay, and then B. Ones. Some of which may not even exist yet during one's lifetime. So kind of similar to what I was talking about with students. So because the author in other parts of the passage, and we can even see up here how the author talks about students as them. And I'm just highlighting all the thems here. And so with all these thems and students, it doesn't really make sense to put ones, especially because one is generally what you refer to like a singular, like you or I, like personal noun. So ones just sounds kind of funny, and also I don't think it's referring to the correct subject here. So I'm also going to eliminate ones. And then C, his or her. So again, similar to ones, his or her is like referring to like a singular subject when we clearly have multiple with students and they and them. And so that doesn't really make sense. And then also in the context of the sentence, some of which may not even exist yet during his or her lifetime. So like technically it covers like a they meaning in terms of like, you know, his or her students, that like sort of collective, but it does so in a way that is also slightly wordier too, because instead of his or her, you could just say they, right? So because of that like wordiness, and also because it's kind of like a little more specific than it needs to be, I'm gonna eliminate that option, which leaves us with the original option that I was kind of suggesting from the beginning there. So some of which may not even exist yet during their lifetime. So there really matches up with the nouns and like pronouns that have been mentioned so far in the passage of they, students, them, their, everything like that. So that aligns with the continuity of the passage. Okay, so those are all the questions I have for this passage. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and catch you in another video.